Welcome, welcome, welcome. So good to have so many of you here. We're grateful that you could come join us for this event tonight, this being our third evening in a 3-week series, Racism in the Church. So we're glad that you can join us for those who've been with us for the previous weeks and just those tuning in as well. For those who may not know, my name is James Aitchison, and I'm a member of the ministry team here at Islington United Church. As well, I'm a member of the Anti-Racism Working Group at Islington, and this is the group that's organized the event and is hosting it tonight. I just want to mention my thanks as well to, for last week, Adam Hanley, who's also a member of the community. He's a voluntary associate minister at Islington United and a member of the Anti-Racism Working Group. He stepped in to serve as moderator last week as I was away, and he hosted Reverend Michael Blair for the second in our series. A great thanks goes to Carol Wilson, who's been instrumental in organizing this series. Certainly everybody who's joining us and speaking knows that she's been the hub keeping things going and connecting the dots. Deep thanks also, gratitude to Grace Quimno for her role in helping to vision and bring this into being. Having already explored in the last weeks a little bit about racism in the church through the lenses of history, politics, and theology, tonight we're inviting the voices of racialized clergy themselves to speak a little bit about their experience of racism in the church and to share some of their vision for the future of our church, ideally stepping into and building an anti-racist future for our church. We'll pause for a moment here to acknowledge the land. So I just invite you to take a moment and maybe even close your eyes and feel your breath. And let yourself be landed here. Let yourself feel gravity anchoring you to this earth. And especially here in Toronto, and certainly for Islington United Church, where I am now, we acknowledge that we are working and worshiping and connecting and communicating and dreaming and building upon traditional territories. Indigenous communities have served as stewards of this land for countless generations. We're hosted on the lands of the Mississaugas of the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Wendat. And we also recognize the enduring presence of all First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples. Thank you for taking a moment just to ground ourselves here. And as I just mentioned at the outset, we will be recording, we already are recording this evening's panel discussion, the event as it unfolds. And the last 2 weeks of this series are already posted on the website. So we'll put a link in the chat here so that you can see that. And please feel free to share that with anybody later on that you feel would like to be a part of the conversation. So I'll just name briefly a bit about the schedule for this evening, what you can expect. Here I'm just giving our sort of introductory framing remarks, and in a moment I'll introduce our guest speakers tonight. Then after that, in a few minutes, we'll have the panel discussion, which will make up most of the evening. We have a few questions for our 3 panelists to explore. Maybe there's a bit of time toward the end of that period to do some cross conversation, but we'll see how our timing is. We're hoping to take a break just about 8:25. That's our target. Obviously, we can be flexible about that. One thing I wanted to mention about the break, it'll be just about a 5-minute break, but we want to invite you to send questions. So you can use the chat function and you can send me questions, or if you send it to Cynthia or one of the other hosts, hopefully they can reroute it to me. But if you see my name there, James, feel free to send me questions about anything coming to your mind or heart during the conversation. And after the break, we'll have about half an hour, maybe 25 minutes of a Q&A, question and answer period. And if you want to focus your question to one particular guest speaker, you can let me know in your question in the chat there, and I'll guide that accordingly. So again, after that break of 5 minutes from 8:30 till near the end, nearly 9 o'clock, we'll do the Q&A. and then I'll just take a couple minutes at the end to wrap up. So that leads us right into our introduction of our guests. So I'll just take a few minutes because we've got 3 guests to introduce. Reverend Maya Douglas, who you'll meet briefly here. She's been the minister at St. James United Church in Etobicoke since September of 2020. And before that, she served Queensville, Holland United Church. She was the minister there, and she also had served at Bloor Street United Church as the intern supply minister. Reverend Maya has a Master of Divinity and a Master of Religious Education. Previous to her work in ministry, she was an elementary school teacher with the TDSB, the Toronto District School Board, for 19 years. Reverend Maya collaborates with other racialized United Church of Canada ministers and the community at large, community activists, and they address anti-Black racism in the church as well as within the wider community. We're grateful to have you with us today, Reverend Maya. I guess I should just mention, as I say, Reverend Maya, many in our community know our Reverend Maya. We have a Reverend Maya, and we often refer to her that way, but Reverend Maya Douglas, great to have you with us too. Reverend Sidney Elias is also with us, and he began his ministry in the Methodist Church in Guyana and served in the Caribbean and the Americas for 14 years. He and his family then moved to Canada. That was 17 years ago. And Reverend Elias was received into the Order of Ministry in the United Church of Canada. And he has served congregations in Shining Waters, in Antler River watershed, and Western Ontario waterways regions. Recently, Reverend Elias was called to a new pastoral relationship with the Bolton and Palgrave congregations, who are now starting a collaborative relationship. Great to have you with us, Reverend Sidney. And Reverend Irene T. is the minister at Westminster United Church in Mississauga, not too far away. Irene is originally from the Philippines. She's of Chinese origin and is conversant in several languages. Since Reverend T's ordination in 2003, she's served in different multi-ethnic congregations in West Toronto, in North York, and in Thornhill. Reverend T served for 5 years as the chair of the Intercultural Committee in the Southwest Presbytery of Toronto, and she currently chairs the advisory board of the Student Christian Movement. Reverend Irene T, great to have you with us. So I'm going to open with a question that each of our guest speakers will address. I feel like we're going to begin with Reverend Maya Douglas. So this first question I'll read, we'll take turns and each of our panelists will address. And if you take, 5 to 7 minutes or whatever it ends up being, for you, Reverend Maya.
I'll try to time myself. My people know I can go on.
Well, that's a gift to have.
No.
It can be, I imagine, anyways. So the first question we're opening with is pretty simple on one level and yet deep and complex experience, I'm sure. What is your experience of racism in congregational settings, both personally and professionally?
Well, thank you, James. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. It is an honor and privilege to be here and to have my voice heard. Just call me Maya. You kind of got away with something because I looked at my notes, and the last time I spoke about racism, I wrote down never again. But then when I found this invitation, I was like, oh, Maya's church, I'll go. And Maya's on sabbatical. So here I am. Experiences of racism. If you don't mind, I will hide behind some images for a while and then I'll come out and say some more. I'm just going to time myself. Good. Okay. So I'm going to share my screen. Here we are. Do you see two little boys? Yes? Okay. So some of my colleagues here who attended the last presbytery meeting of Living Waters may remember this image where I talked about my 2 sons. They're twins. One is darker than the other. And I share that personally as a congregant, and Actually, other times as a minister, when I had my twins with me, sometimes someone would go up to the children and say, I know who the bad one is. I know who the troublemaker is. And they always chose the darker twin. And I shared that as an example of me being in a church and experiencing a form of racism, colorism, right? Shadeism. The darker one is going to be the troublemaker. I also shared the event of finding out that I was having two boys and knowing the statistic that 1 out of 2 men who are racialized, who are Black, will experience some sort of police brutality or violence in their life. And so when I found out with my partner of the time, their father, that we were having 2 boys, we were distraught. Our first response was, oh no, because we were having 2 children that would grow up to be Black men. And as most of you must know by now, especially if you followed the series, I'm hoping that there was some sort of talk around racialized men, Black men being in danger. If not, I'm the one to share that. These 2 boys are going to grow up as men. And one of the safest places that they'll be will be church. And so those little comments can be quite harming, though they're unintentional and they are not meant to harm, they are harmful. Another experience of racism is, and for all of you to understand, when I say that someone acts as a racist or is racist, we have to take away this whole idea that if you're racist, you are bad. We live in a system of racism where white is better than other colors, okay? Other colored, racialized people, because race is a fake construct. We are all people, right? So when I say racist or racism, I want you to reflect on how you feel about that and to understand that it's just a description of hierarchy, not a slur towards someone saying that they're bad. Let's see if I can function this. So I have been asked during Black History Month to speak at several churches before I got my MDiv and definitely after. And when I'm asked to speak, oftentimes churches will ask for a bio, but they'll also ask for a picture. And one particular event, when I was asked to speak and I was asked for a picture, I sent this picture. I'm in Newfoundland. I am very happy. This is basically me at my finest during General Council in Corner Brook. We went to Grossmorn Park and here I am. This is me. And they got back to me and asked me for another photo. And this is the photo they wanted. They wanted to see me Afrocentric, okay? So that's that stereotype of attaching, this is also me, but this is not me most of the time. Those of you who know me, the previous picture is a better representation of who I am, and it's what I was offering up to the community. And the community said, well, could you have something more African? We're doing this whole theme, and that's fine. I'm of African descent, but my family is from Jamaica, and I don't know, Jamaica and Newfoundland seem very similar. Love the food, love the people. It was just, I felt like I was home, and that was the picture that I wanted. So that's how racism crops up. Another thing with me speaking at other places is that I'm often told that I speak so well. Oh my gosh, you speak so well. And that statement is a racist statement. So I'm sharing with you this triangle, it's 5 minutes, of what white supremacy looks like, because white supremacy works within the whole racist system of white being better than Black. And we all know about, the overt white supremacy, but things at the bottom, if you look at it, you might recognize some things that you may not have realized. You are so articulate is one of them. Denial of racism is another. The church is not separate from the society. When you have people that are gathered together in a racist society, you're going to have racism. A lot of our churches has this image. It's The Head of Christ by Walter Salmon. It is a representation of Jesus looking very Nordic with blue eyes. It is very inaccurate as to what the historic Jesus would look like. If you were to go into a church and said, take that down, the response to that would be exceptionally racist. They will say, okay, it's a tradition, it's our church, that picture has been up for a long time. But if you say to them, that picture is triggering to anyone who is of color, because if Jesus is white and we believe as Christians that Jesus is God, then that means that God is white. And God is spirit. And the risen Christ has no color, right? Represented in many different ways. And I take part in this racism. This is my daughter, my second daughter, who is part of a pageant. We had to do an online pageant, so we did still pictures of the children dressed up as different characters. She's Mary. And when she was given the doll that would be Jesus, it was a white doll. Anybody who knows, a black woman will not have a white child. So if you're going to have a black child represent Mary, the doll should be black. I'm the mother, I'm the minister. She has a lot of black dolls, and it never occurred to me to go and grab a black doll because I have learned that Jesus is white. So this is the work for the whole church. Okay? And these are examples. I'm going to look, one more. Images like this exist. And yet, if I were to ask many of you, if not all of you, if you do have an image of a black Holy Family in your church, many of you may not have this. And the question is, why not? Why not? And going back to the head of Christ, how many of you have that up in your church right now? Or Jesus standing at the door knocking? You know that one? It's the same artist from the same time, around World War II, when anti-Semitism was not only in Europe, it was also in America, to be honest. And so that was an anti-Semitist kind of response to creating this Jesus image that went in all of the churches. And right now, we still have them. My question is, why? This image, why not? And my question for the other image is why? Because when my children walk through the church and they see a white Jesus, they believe that God is white. Why aren't there diverse representations? I think I'll leave it at that because my esteemed colleagues, I'm sure, have other experiences to share and examples.
Thank you, Maya. Thank you for opening us and with that powerful reflection. I'm going to invite Reverend Irene T. to step into this same question. What is your experience of racism in congregational settings, both personal and professional?
Thank you. It's good to be here and happy to be part of this series with Islington United Church where I did my internship. So good to see some of you who are on my lay committee. And I also see Reverend Mark Aitchison, who was my supervisor. And happy to see all of you and some people here from St. James, also my home church, and people here from Westminster, which is my current church. So for this question, I have three examples, three experiences. The first one is my time at St. Elizabeth's Anglican Church. So I was born in the Philippines, and we were Episcopalians in the Philippines. And when we came to Canada, of course, we looked for an Anglican church, and we lived in southern Etobicoke, and we found a home with St. Elizabeth's. I don't know how many of you know that that existed. It used to be on Queensway, just east of Islington, on the north side of Queensway, across from a Canadian Tire, which Canadian Tire is no longer there, and the church is no longer there. It's a condo now. So our family went there, and we were welcomed. It was about probably 99% white Anglo-Saxon people, Caucasians. So my sister and I and my brother, my sister and I were teenagers. We were asked to join the choir, and there was only one choir. It was a senior choir, very small choir. And my sister also taught Sunday school. And my father was asked to be a usher. It's called a sidesman in the Anglican church back then. And just to give a context, that was in the 70s and 80s. And the parish was already on decline. And there weren't any young people to speak of. My family was the only young people. And actually, eventually it closed. And eventually it went to a Cantonese-speaking Anglican church. So my experience there was that, I didn't experience racism per se, but they didn't know how to utilize our gifts and our talents. And actually, they probably didn't know how to invite or welcome young people in general. One example is my sister and I, she played the guitar, and we loved to sing popular songs. And they could have invited us to sing, the songs that we like, but that never happened. And I don't recall them ever asking us to share of our culture, like our Chinese and Filipino culture. So it was unfortunate. I feel that they had missed out. But we kept going to that church because we were loyal, and we just were brought up to keep going to church on Sunday. And the interesting thing is, as I mentioned, eventually the church did close, and a Cantonese-speaking Anglican church went there. And my mother ended up joining that church later on in her life, because even though she doesn't speak Cantonese, she liked the fellowship. She could speak Mandarin, and sometimes they translated the sermon to Mandarin. But she loved the fellowship and the wonderful food. They always had lunch after every service. And she always invited me to go, but unfortunately I never made it there on a Sunday after church. So that's my first experience at St. Elizabeth's Anglican Church. The second experience I want to share is about a United Church. This is about 20 years ago, or maybe less than that, because I'm already a United Church minister. And we used to have a cottage near Apsley, just south of Bancroft. And I used to go worship there at Trinity United once in a while in Apsley. And one summer I went there, and after church, I introduced myself to the minister, a white woman. And I told her I was a minister and I went to Emmanuel College, things like that. And somehow she found out I was born in the Philippines. And after that, she kept telling me about a family that lives on Highway 28 that's from the Philippines. And do I know them? I said, no. But she kept wanting to talk about that. And I kept giving her leads about, I'm a minister, I go to Emmanuel. I would have loved to have a colleague-to-colleague conversation, but that didn't happen. And sadly, I did go back to the church another time. I think it was the same summer or maybe the year after, and she was there. And the same thing happened. So I'm laughing now, but it's kind of sad because, of course, after that, I didn't want to go back there anymore because she didn't really want to talk to me, or she didn't really listen. She wasn't listening to me. And my third experience is of a congregation I served at Northminster United Church in North York. And the church, they've since, when I left, they've closed and amalgamated with Cummer, that had become Cummer Avenue United Church. But I was called there in 2007. And before I was asked to come before I was officially starting to meet with a small group of people, the 3 choir members, because we had to select a music director. So the 3 choir members have never met me. So, and just to let you know, at this church, they also rent out to 2 Korean congregations. And that day, one of the congregations was having a Bible study. And so when I arrived, the 3 choir members who were waiting for me, one of them looked at me and said to me, "That way." She pointed to where the Korean church was having a Bible study. So she assumed that I was a Korean member coming for Bible study. And after that, when she found out who I was, she apologized and she felt so badly. And just to let you know, up to today, she's still a friend of mine. But it just goes to show you how much we assume, we assume. I don't know what she expected her minister to look like, her new minister to look like. But, even if I was coming for that Bible study, it would have been nice to just be greeted and say, "Hello, how are you?" Instead of like, "Oh, that way." So I'm going to stop there and let our next panelist speak. Thank you.
Thank you, Reverend T. Appreciate your sharing and witnessing the power of assumption there and people seeing color first, even if they try to talk around it or, find another connection. But well, thank you. And we will pass it along now to Reverend Sidney Elias with the same question. Reverend Sidney, what has been your experience of racism in congregational settings, both personal and professional?
Thank you very much, James, and thank you to the congregation of Islington United for inviting me to share in this. It continues to be a very important discussion, and I trust that emerging from all that you have been doing, we will see some positive changes in terms of addressing the issue of racism. My experience, there have been a few times when I was made to feel almost invisible and of little value. Times when I felt that I was treated as an afterthought to be engaged after those who mattered were heard. There have been a few such times. And there were times when I was questioned about myself in a manner that made me feel that the intention was not to get to know me better, but to assess my qualification, my worthiness, my acceptability. And I'm not speaking here about during an interview. This was what was supposed to be casual conversation. And then there were times when, like Maya, I was excessively praised by persons who could not hide their surprise that I spoke so well. Now, apart from those kinds of responses, which to me often have racist overtones and undertones, I will find it difficult to name specific overt acts of racism that I have experienced in any congregation. Now, one may conclude from that racism does not exist in those congregations, or that it is not a serious issue. but nothing can be further from the truth. I may not have found many congregants who openly displayed racist actions and behaviors. And I believe that part of the reason for that is that most persons know better than to do so. But what I have found is that they are, in many of those congregations, persons who are comfortable being part of a congregation within which there exists a culture that is permissive of actions or lack of actions that do great harm to race relations. Actions that set up barriers and actions that do not dismantle existing barriers. In one congregation, I recall when I inquired about the absence of racialized minorities, even though the congregation sat in the middle of a very diverse community, the response I got was, we don't exclude anyone. I found that response to be dismissive and troubling. It was troubling because it did not exhibit the slightest sense of concern about the absence of racialized minority within the congregation. It was clear that those with whom I was speaking were quite comfortable with and were not disturbed by that fact. Let me share something that happened to me early in my ministry, or maybe two things. I recall in my first call, I got a telephone call from a colleague in the same presbytery at the time. And he asked me if I can do a funeral for him. I was preparing to travel to Guyana the next day. But before I could tell him that, he proceeded to tell me why he was asking me to take the funeral. He said to me that there was this young man who was shot, and he was Jamaican. And he's asking me if I would do the funeral because in this view, it often or sometimes happens that when you do a funeral for a family, that family may sometimes want to form a relationship with the congregation. And in his words, he said, I don't think that this congregation, that's referring to his congregation, I don't think that this congregation would be a right fit for them. I was blown away beyond words. Those are the kinds of things that we sometimes encounter because there exists, as I said, that culture within many congregations where people are just comfortable existing in a situation where there is no sense or no presence of diversity, but seem unwilling to do anything about it. And let me share one more example. This goes back to when I was interviewing with a conference interview board at the time. After I was asked all the questions that they had to ask me, they asked me if I had any questions. Now I'd just come to, well, I'd been to Canada at the time for about 2 years or so. I had visited several United Church congregations in Toronto and most in Scarborough. And in all my visits, I did not see a single Black minister, which was a surprise to me coming to a country, at a town, a city that was supposed to be the most diverse city in North America. So I asked the team if there are any Black clergy in the United Church. No, sorry, in the Toronto Conference. And there was an awkward silence. And then one of the ministers said to me, I don't know of any. Of course, the entire interview panel was white. And he said, I don't know of any. And I found that to be very surprising. But that wasn't the end of it. When the interview was finished, there was also another interview taking place in an adjoining room in the same building. And shortly after that interview also concluded, and there stepped out of that interview the Reverend Eleanor Scarlett, who is Black. She came to me because she knew I was coming there. She wanted to introduce herself. And I was shocked beyond words that here you have a Black minister in an adjoining room and a white colleague in the next room is saying to me that he does not know if there is any Black ministers in Toronto. That was my introduction to the United Church, and that said a lot. I'll stop there.
Thank you for sharing your experience, Reverend Elias. Very powerful. Well, with that in sight or in our awareness now, we're looking to shift the conversation a little bit, and having seen several examples of overt and covert racism in the church, I want to ask each of you in a slightly different order this time, ask you to share a little bit about what is your vision of an anti-racist church. I'm going to begin this time with Reverend T. If you'll join us and speak into that. What is your vision of an anti-racist church?
Thank you. And you pronounced my last name correctly. So I'm going to start with a vision and share my experience of trying to enact that vision. So my vision is somewhat comes from, a lot of my study with intercultural ministries, which is what I had been my passion for many years. So a vision of anti-racist church is a place where everyone's gifts are celebrated and nourished, where differences are honored and respected, where people feel comfortable to bring their whole selves into church or into worship. And people do not have to leave a part of themselves at the door. So with that kind of vision in mind, I'd just like to share some of my experiences of mainly at one of the churches that I was at Northminster in 2007 to 2013. This is the church in North York. And it's in a very multicultural area. Probably the main ethnic groups are Filipino, Korean, Iranians. However, the congregation, of course, in this case, does not reflect that in the congregation. And as I mentioned earlier, the church eventually did, during my time actually, decided to close and amalgamate with the nearby church, because they really, I think they still saw themselves as a program church, and they wanted to be with another congregation that they could continue doing what they were doing. So I found the church, the time I was there, the changing some culture was very difficult. They had certain standards of worship in terms of sermon, music, the style. For example, they had certain ideas about what was part of worship and what wasn't part of worship. So when I started some small group discussion during some of the worship time, that wasn't well received. Or talking about birthdays, celebrating birthdays, who's got a birthday this month, that kind of thing. Again, that wasn't part of worship, that's more for fellowship. And the other part was a PowerPoint. I introduced a PowerPoint in that church, and it was also very slowly received, if you like. So their theology was liberal, but their worship was very traditional, I would say. They value good music, excellent music based on organ and classical music. And so at that time, the More Voices was just coming out. So we were starting to introduce it, but it was slowly received, I should say. They didn't want to go too fast on it. They found it, some of the songs kind of like camp songs, which to me is kind of like a put down, right? It's like, it's not serious. So again, you know, they don't mind new music as long as it's good quality. But who defines good quality, right? So I found that the kind of rigidity, with this kind of rigidity, it was difficult to try new things. And a newcomer mentioned to me that she felt, when she came into that church, she felt like she had to be very quiet. She couldn't drop a book or say anything. It would be like, you know, breaking, it would disturb people. So that's sort of the context of the church. But what I did find that worked that became successful was an outreach to Filipino migrants. We did have a few worshipers who had Filipino background, and you know, were very active in their church back home, who were part of the United Church of Christ in the Philippines. But there was only like maybe 2 or 3 of them in the congregation. However, when we discovered that they had a lot of friends that may be interested in a kind of a Bible study, we started holding a Friday evening Bible study for mainly caregivers who worked, you know, Monday to Friday and lived in someone's home. And on Friday night, they were free to go home on the weekend to their apartment. So it was the right time to catch on Friday night, 7 to 9 o'clock, to have a Bible study, fellowship, and a meal. It was a potluck. So I found quite a lot of success with this Bible study, and it was maybe 12 to 15 people that would come on a Friday evening. And there was leadership that was unleashed in this group. I saw them leading music, playing guitar, leading the Bible study, you know, preparing food, and also planning. They planned events. And we also drew people from the community who were activists, and they were attracted to the United Church because we were concerned about social justice issues. So there were folk like that started to come to this group. And at one point, they also did an outreach in the community using the gym of the church to have a basketball on I forget what evening it was, for the youth in the community. And then so from time to time, this group, which is called Filipino Christian Fellowship, by the way, and from time to time, we would invite them to sing at Northminster in the main congregation, main service. So that worked well. So what I learned from this experience was that sometimes, you know, new migrants need to meet on their own to feel comfortable and to, you know, be able to speak their own language, just so they could relax. And then they gain strength and leadership and confidence from there. And then they can, you know, give their input into the main congregation, to the mainstream church, I would call them. And I have since been to either minister or see other churches that have this kind of, maybe it's not an outreach ministry, but they have a Filipino praise choir. And I've seen that at Asbury and West United Church and at Cooksville United Church. So sometimes you can't just, you know, put somebody and make them join the main choir. And maybe you have to facilitate and say, okay, we'll create, like, it's like a youth choir or a folk choir or a spiritual choir. In this case, they're called Filipino Praise Choir at one of the churches anyway. Sometimes you have to create that kind of option for people, and they will join, and you'll have a lot more people joining that than to join a traditional choir. Perhaps because they can feel freer to choose the kind of music they like, that kind of thing. And that's sort of, you know, when I was growing up at St. Elizabeth's, my first church, if they had created a folk choir, that would have been wonderful for me. Okay, I'm going to stop there.
Thank you, Reverend T, for sharing a little bit about your vision of the anti-racist church, and also some of the experiences that has informed that vision. I'm going to ask Reverend Elias to step in here and speak to this question as well, whether grounded in some of your past experience or just an ideal vision. But what do you see as the future of an anti-racist church, Reverend Elias?
I rather suspect that my vision is very similar to what most persons would have for an anti-racist church. My vision is of a church where there is greater representation of minorities at every level. But that representation must move beyond tokenism. And it must be more than just an act of affirmative action, as that term is commonly understood. It must also be more than just numerical, because one thing to see more minorities in our congregations and in our conferences and positions of leadership, that's one thing. But persons, like Reverend Tai was saying, must be made to feel free to bring their whole selves, their gifts, their stories, their culture, their perspectives shaped by their experiences and values. And it must be a church where minorities know that they are seen, heard, and valued, where persons' gifts and talents are recognized and affirmed and celebrated. Let me share an example here of what I'm talking about. When I first started out in United Church, I was invited to what was called the Journeys of Black People in the United Church. And the gathering was in Montreal. Up to that time, the only Black minister that I had known was Eleanor Scarlett, as I mentioned before. When I gathered with others in Montreal, I was completely shocked and surprised to see the number of Black persons who were ministers within the United Church. It was a pleasant surprise to me. But then I also came to realize that there was something beneath it as well. And that was the majority of the folks that I spoke with were serving in these far-flung rural congregations. And then I learned that it was not always by choice, that many found it difficult to compete in the larger urban centers, and therefore had little or no choice but to go into one of those congregations. Not that they didn't like it, mind you, not that they weren't flourishing where they were, not that they weren't engaged in meaningful, rich relationships and ministries, But the point is that they were not valued for what they brought, for who they were, and all those kinds of things. So when we speak of an anti-racist church, my vision very simply is one that recognizes, that celebrates the gifts that persons bring, and that provide the space and the freedom for them, for person to live into those gifts, to share their stories, as I said, their culture and their perspectives shaped by their whole experiences. Again, sometimes as a minister, serving, because that has been part of my experience, for good or for bad, I have served most of my ministry in white congregations. And I have had very rich experiences in those congregations. But there's also the fact that I can't help but feel that at times when, they want me, yes, for my preaching and whatever else I do, but there are other aspects of my whole self that I don't feel free to offer. So that, to me, when we can get to that point, then we would have achieved the goal, the vision of an anti-racist church. Thank you.
Thank you, Reverend Elias. Beautiful vision indeed. We will pass it over now to to Maya, Reverend Douglas.
Maya's fine.
For the same vision.
I used to call myself the other Maya. Maya hated that, Maya Lendell, but yeah, you can tell her that you saw the other Maya. My friends, my vision of an anti-racist church. That's a lot of work. I think our church is really good at being intercultural at times, and even being non-racist. But the difference between being non-racist and anti-racist is this. It's a difference between a church that says we're welcoming to gay couples, we're welcoming to gay, and then there's a church that's affirming. Okay? So an anti-racist church, I'm going to let Harry in, an anti-racist church is a church that's actually working against the system of racism. And that's a lot of work, especially if that church is struggling with their own racism within themselves. Okay? So I'll quote Audre Lorde. We've all been programmed to respond to human differences between us with fear and loathing, and to handle that difference in one of three ways. Ignore it, and if that is not possible, copy it if we think it's dominant, or destroy it if we think it's subordinate. But we have no patterns for relating across our human differences as equals. To be anti-racist, to be an anti-racist is a radical choice in the face of history, requiring a radical reorientation of our consciousness. So my vision of an anti-racist church is amazingly hard and difficult and large. We've heard of hiring practices. We've heard of welcoming, of being ourselves all the way outside into the church door. I've shared images in the church. But the reorientation, my vision of an anti-racist church is when every single person in our church, United Church of Canada, every congregant, every person in general council actually work on their own racism, their own biases, accept their biases, struggle with their biases, and work from within. So we are a people of faith, right? So the whole idea of changing our hearts. Last week, we followed the lectionary. We heard about all of the members of Christ's body. If you followed the lectionary and read the Corinthians reading. Okay, 1 Corinthians 12. Every member is important. You know, the little pinky toe is as important as the eye. The eye can't say, I'm not important because I can't hear. All of the members have value. And until that is possible, we're not there. We may be intercultural, we may be non-racist, we may celebrate each other's differences, but it's an actual work of changing our hearts. Reflecting on, I want to put Black Lives Matter on the church sign. Does that require a committee meeting? If so, why? Do Black Lives Matter? Yes. Does God feel like Black Lives Matter? Yes. If you do not have to have a church meeting about any other statement on your church sign, why might you have to have a meeting about Black Lives Matter? And reflect on how you feel inside as the minister, as the racialized minister, and how everyone else around you how you feel inside. And then here's the interesting thing. My vision of the anti-racist church is we have that vulnerable, courageous conversation, not about the sign, but about our feelings and about the theology behind it, about Black liberation theology. We have that conversation. We respond every single time when bodies are found at Indigenous residential schools. We respond to Asian hate, especially at the beginning of COVID. We respond even if we don't have one Asian in our church. Why? Because we're all made in God's image. We all have value. We all are born into that love and are transformed by it. And that is what an anti-racist church looks like. Not non-racist, not intercultural, but actually working against the system. That's the meaning of anti-racist. Working against the system of racism, which says that white is supreme and everyone is othered. Everyone else of another race is othered, as if white is not a race. We are all racialized people, right? Anti-racist church, dare I say, will not need to have this conversation because we're all doing the work, right? An anti-racist church will celebrate and actually say out loud, our first Black General Secretary is Michael Blair, and will announce it as such, honoring the fact that he was chosen based on his merit. But he is not invisible. We are not colorblind. It is okay to say that he's Black. I say that because he's here and he's my mentor, and I'm very outspoken about that. You know, so that's my vision of an anti-racist church, that we are actually able to take those risks and say it. Say the things, say the hard things, because isn't that what the gospel is about? It's about saying the hard things in love, in respect, in vulnerability, in acceptance, in belonging. That's my vision of it. How am I addressing white supremacy? Might be a question that we would ask ourselves as churches, because let's be honest, most of our United churches are mostly white with a smattering of diversity. So how do we deal with white supremacy, right? So the comfort zone is I stay silent, I deny my white privilege, I say all lives matter, which is a no-no. So you might not say that, but you know, you still see racism as a binary. Me, white, others. Or others thinking there's others and white. And it's not so. We're all part of the spectrum, but we're all human beings. And moving into the growth zone, because there is a fair zone, moving into the growth zone of actually reflecting. And so images like that, to continue my, right? Notre Dame de Paris. This is in Paris, in the church. Different churches from around the world offered artwork of their nativity scene, right? Beautiful. And I was blown. I'm in Europe. Aren't we supposed to be Eurocentric in Europe? And yet I'm seeing diversity. I go to Canada that's diverse, and I don't get to see this. And I wept. We have images with diversity. And my vision is my child offering to volunteer her gifts and talents at a church where she felt welcome. Even though she was in the minority, this is my vision of anti-racism in a church. Because we did not put her in this cultural, she's Black, so let's give her some drums, She wanted to play a classical piece on her cello, which for her this is what she does. And it was fine. It existed. It took place in a space where she felt accepted and she felt that she belonged, and it just came naturally to play the music that she loved. And it was her gift to the congregation in praise of God. And that is what I see happening, that we don't pigeonhole the children into doing something outside of what they want to do, because that is what we do when we're intercultural. But we actually just say, you know what? You're a child of God. This is your gift and talent. We are going to do this. We are going to resist the temptation of saying, Black child, African drum, African dancing, Black History Month, here we go. So that's my vision. I don't know, it's really hard to grasp and to make it tangible. I hope I did in some way. Because, we're not there yet. And it's a vision. It can and it will change. And that's okay.
Thank you, Maya, for sharing a glimpse of this vision. And indeed, as you named at the front end of that, it's big and it's hard to articulate, and we're certainly far from it. And yet I felt some threads or common threads there between the three of you, and gifts celebrated, stories, perspectives shared freely. Reverend Sidney talking about everyone being seen, heard, and valued for who they are. And so powerful. Something standing out there, Maya, the work of changing our hearts. I think that just can't be emphasized enough. And was it Audre Lorde who you had quoted? Audre Lorde, no patterns for how to relate as equals.
Yes, it's found in the book, How to Be an Anti-Racist, which can go with the next question. Great. I actually have a list of books that I recommend to all of you to delve into. I'm still reading them, so don't get upset if you don't like the book, but awesome. Highly recommend.
You can post that as well on the website. Well, this Absolutely. Very much leads naturally into our third question, and it's connecting the first two questions basically with the experience of the reality of racism in the church. How do we move toward the vision of an anti-racist church? And you can draw from whatever experience you have, what hasn't worked, what moments have worked. Reverend T already touched a little bit on some of that. Well, I guess all of you did in your way. I'm going to begin with Reverend Sidney for this question. So how do we move from the reality of racism in the church towards this vision of an anti-racist church?
Well, first of all, I think we need to appreciate that it's a journey, so that it is not just a question of something that we accomplish in a set time and then we move on to whatever else there is that catches our attention. It's a journey that will continue for all our lives. How do we get there? First of all, I think we have to be very intentional. It's not going to happen on its own. And part of that intentionality is to recognize that there are congregations that are better positioned to actualize that vision and to work with those congregations to help them to do so, so that they can be examples and that they can inspire others to do likewise. Some of that is already happening on the initiative of individual congregations, but I think there should be an intentional approach to encourage others. Let me address two things that I believe highlight the problem, but which appear to be largely ignored. One is the calling of ministers. There are many congregations that are located in majority ethnic neighborhoods. And most of those congregations are almost entirely white. Many of them have few members who live in the immediate community, the immediate environment of the church. And many of those congregations, even though they have been in existence for over 100 years, have never had a non-white minister. Many of them are struggling to survive. And when they call, or when they have to call a minister, we often hear that they are looking for a minister who is a good fit. They like to use that expression, a good fit. And they would explain that to mean a good fit with the vision and theology and so forth of the congregation. But what is often overlooked, or what is often not acknowledged, is that it also means someone who is a good fit with the congregation, which is older and white and wedded to a culturally exclusive expression of worship and engagement. That is often overlooked. When what they should be looking for is someone who is a good fit, not just with the congregation, but with the community in which the church is located and which is its immediate parish. And so the result is that they often call ministers who do not have the cultural competence to help the congregation connect with the community. And the community does not see itself represented in those congregations. Now that is part, I think, of the hard work that Maya was talking about. Now, I'm not suggesting that only Black ministers or minority ministers should be called to churches in minority communities or vice versa. I'm not suggesting that only Black or minority ministers can competently offer ministry in those contexts. What I am saying is that when you have white clergy serving a white congregation in a community that is predominantly diverse, then we have a problem. We do have a problem, which is quite different to a minority person serving a white congregation in a white community, because the congregation already is able to connect with the community. So there's less of an issue there. Now, it occurred to me the other day, when we talk about pursuing this vision, achieving this vision, a big part of it is how do persons see themselves and their place and their future within the United Church of Canada, or the minority people that is. How many minority children and young people who grew up in the United Church see themselves as being future leaders in their congregations or in the church? My mind was drawn to something some time ago. And again, I don't speak from a position of absolute knowledge here. I may be wrong. Maya might be better able to correct me if I am. But I wondered how many of the Black clergy, I'm going to confine myself to Black clergy here, how many of the Black clergy in the United Church of Canada are born Canadians? I asked that question because from my limited interactions, the overwhelming majority that I know are immigrants like myself. And it raises in my mind the question, do our young people who grew up in the United Church see themselves represented in that church? Do they see themselves as being a future minister or chairman of or chairperson rather of the board or council or whatever else there is? So if we are going to achieve that vision, then we have to also address that issue of how our young people, racialized minority young people, are being socialized within the United Church of Canada, particularly when they grow up in communities that reflect the very opposite of what they see in the church. So for me, when we talk about how to achieve that vision, a significant part of that process would require that we be very intentional in making sure that those that we are seeking to serve and to meet and to connect with can see themselves represented in that church. Now, in terms of what has worked, I don't think, frankly, that a lot of the statements that the church would have issued over the years have made any impact whatsoever. I've been hearing about statement about racism for almost forever since I've been here, but nothing really has changed. So the time has come for us to move away from just issuing statements. One thing that I think has worked to some extent is the introduction of Church Hub, where the ministers post their profile and their stories or whatever it is. And I think it has worked because rather than just dismissing somebody because you feel from all the identity markers that the person is a minority, at least you are able to get a chance to read about the person's story, about what the person brings, about the person's vision, the person's experience. And I find, maybe my own experience, I can't speak for everybody else, that has in some ways created more opportunities for persons to want to connect, because they can now see or have a sense of what you bring. They can look past the fact that you might be a racialized minority. So I would say two things to start. It's not the sum total, but at least if you can begin to work on those things. One is to get past this idea that a fit must only be based on the congregation and its theology and vision. But a fit must also take into consideration the community in which the church is located. And that secondly, more and more people must be encouraged to try to find out more than just the identity of the person, the racial identity of the person, whether it's a minister, whether it's a potential member, or whether it's somebody who is applying for some position within the church. If you can begin to do that, then I think we can see that process, that vision beginning to be realized. Thank you.
Thank you, Reverend Elias. The power of intentionality there stands out. And thank you for exploring that good fit piece. There's a lot there. And I think it could be that there could be a lot of avoidance of growth hiding behind words like good fit and seeking comfort instead of really leaning in to courage and living gospel, really. So thank you for that. I'd like to ask Reverend Irene T. to step into this conversation and speak a little bit about, again, how to move from the reality of racism in the church, moving towards the vision of an anti-racist church.
So this is a photo I wanted to share earlier of the Filipino Christian Fellowship that was meeting when I was at Northminster as the outreach ministry. So earlier I shared my vision of anti-racist church, where a place where everyone's gifts are celebrated and nourished, where differences are honored and respected. And one way that we've been doing that, and I'm just going to be sharing my experiences. One way that we've been doing that at Westminster United Church, where I am now, is by having celebrations of cultural celebrations. So for example, Black History Month, Asian Heritage Month, Filipino Heritage Month, that kind of thing. And it's this is a photo of, I think this was actually a newcomers meeting, but it's an example of where we gather folk, for example, for Black History Month. We're starting to meet about that. And of course, we're meeting by Zoom, but 2 years ago, we met in person, and I would gather people from, who are Black to talk about their experiences and what they'd like to see in a Black History Month celebration. So these are just some of the photos of people there at our church. I think this was what do you call that? Remembrance Day. So we've been finding at Westminster having the cultural months a good way to begin the journey of becoming an intercultural church and becoming an anti-racist church, because it's a way to invite folk from that culture to come forward, to invite them to share and to hear their stories and their experiences. So for example, this month, we've invited people on Zoom to talk about what they'd like to see in worship service for Black History Month. And it's interesting, sometimes we start to talk about our experience of racism. And one person said, well, we don't really want to do that in worship service. We know all that, but then actually we don't. Some of the people in my congregation don't know those stories. And another person in the committee actually said, yeah, we might not need to go into the details, but we need to acknowledge the pain and to acknowledge the past and talk about how did people overcome these issues, right? It's not just going straight to the celebrations, but we want to talk about you know, the experiences, the problems that they've overcome. That's what we're celebrating. So you need to share the trouble before the celebration or the grace. So of course, these celebrations, we always do food. There's food, except for COVID, but in other years we have food. We have, we also ask people to bring arts and crafts from their home countries to display. So you see some of them now in my office with the flags, but I had a few pictures of our communion table and the decorations in the sanctuary and what they look like. It's really beautiful, and people enjoy bringing their items from back home to share in church. Another way that I found that worked for us was when I was in Thornhill United Church, they formed an intercultural working group. And what we did was we prepared a 5-page document, which was accepted and adopted by their church council. And in this document, it consisted of, you know, what was the background of intercultural church, you know, that the general council adopted this and what it means, the theological rationale. It showed the demographics of around Thornhill United Church. It presented the goals and the action plan. And then it was adopted by the church. So what I'm saying is, to become an intercultural church, it has to be intentional. It's not just by accident that it happens. So the council accepted it, and then a group of 5 people were formed to be part of this team. And they met regularly to plan activities, including book study, worship services, and of course, potluck lunches. And other things that were done was there's a welcome table. When people come in, there's a place where people know that, you know, they can get information about the church. And it's also culturally sensitive. There are some items, I think, translated to another language. And as well, in the PowerPoint screens on the welcome, the first screen has a welcome in different languages, in the languages that are found in the area of Thornhill. So these are just small things, but it at least helps people to feel that when they come in, that they're welcome. They see their language up there. They see that there's an effort being made. So that was my experience at Thornhill. So going forward, you know, I know that we need to go beyond the cultural services and the cultural lunch, that kind of thing. But what I'd like to work further with my church is find ways to build relationships with one another. So one way we can do this is through the community building time. Sometimes this is built into at the beginning time of worship. Before COVID, I used to ask people to pair up with somebody they don't know very well and just talk for 5 minutes about something very like an icebreaker. You know, how did you get to church? Or what do you appreciate about living in Canada? That kind of thing. And then I've also experienced, sometimes we can organize like having meaningful conversations, you know, after church, either reflecting on the sermon or giving a topic that people could discuss. And I've seen this work well when after a sermon by Reverend Kim Cragg, she led us in a workshop. This was at Comer Avenue. And she asked us to share our names and where our names come from. And it seems simple enough, but it was very powerful the way she set it up, that everybody was on an equal footing and everyone shared with one another as equals. It didn't matter how long you were there at the church, but we all felt that we were starting together. So having meaningful conversations. And another thing that we're doing at Westminster is we're using the respectful guidelines that came from Eric Law originally, but basically Respect stands for R. R is for respect. I don't have all the letters in front of me, but it's a group norms, right? About, taking turns and saying the I language, basically having respect for one another. So I think something like this, putting in place will hopefully help people feel more comfortable in sharing and being part of a committee. I think I'm going to stop there.
Thank you, Reverend T. Yeah, there's a lot to reflect on there. In the interest of time, we'll keep it moving, and I'll open it to Maya now. And Maya, don't sweat the time. We'll take a short break.
I'm looking at the time. I like to honor the time because we're supposed to have a break right now, and some people might need to go to the washroom. Feel free to step away. I wouldn't even know anyway, so I won't feel bad or anything, but don't feel like this is a hostage situation. It's not one of my sermons. That's another story. Well, how? The question is, how do we move from the experience or reality of racism in the church to the vision of an anti-racist church? This is one of the examples of how. I'm amazed by the numbers of people who are here that are willing to listen to this panel discussion and to engage in this kind of forum. I just want to uplift that. All of you who are here, you are taking maybe the third or the fourth or the first step towards some work that the church needs to do. And so I'd like to give you kudos for being here and to thank you for giving us your time and allowing us to have a voice. How? Well, one aspect of racism is to dehumanize, right? So the whole aspect, the race construct is actually quite new when you look at all of history. And part of it was so that people could be sold and traded as if they were things, mistreated in their own countries because they weren't human. So there was an action of dehumanizing. The church likes to use words like decolonizing the church and working towards anti-racism. But if we actually just thought of it as rehumanizing the church, to see our own humanity and how precious we are in God's sight. I got that idea. My folks from St. James know that I like me some Brené Brown. I really love her writing. And she's talking about dealing with scarcity, which our churches are dealing with. Unless somebody has a church that is like bursting at the seams, you can send those folks to my church. We all are dealing with this understanding of scarcity, less people are going to church. And she said, honest conversations about vulnerability and shame are disruptive. There is shame in racism. The reason that we're not having these conversations is that they shine light in the dark corners. And that really resonated with me because Jesus is the light, right? Shining light in the dark corners. Being here in this conversation, having this conversation. Sidney, I was hearing you. I've been hearing you over and over again. So yes, I am born in Canada. My family went to United Church because in Jamaica they went to a Methodist church. Now let's think about this. They came from Jamaica and they found out that the Methodist Church is now part of the United Church, which means that all of our United Churches should be full of Jamaicans, right? So what happened? Luckily, I was at a church where I was seen and valued as a human, as a young person. My feelings were important. My perceptions were important. My opinions were important. My history, my biography was important. And I was not racialized. I was seen as a child. So let's be honest, I think I'm the only Black minister in the city of Toronto. if you count Toronto as Etobicoke, York, North York, East York, and Scarborough. Somebody can type in to correct me and give me a list of 5 other Black ministers, and that would be great. 5 other Black ministers. I want 5 others because I need my colleagues and my friends nearby. But I actually think I'm the only one, and I'm in Etobicoke. And this is Toronto. Okay? And then I'm one of the few that grew up in Canada, went to the United Church, and saw that church leadership is somewhere that I can go. And that was because of my mentors. That is Lindy Brown, Claudette Nita, Priscilla Brandy, the racialized people in the congregation, and then Reverend Warren McDougall, not racialized, very welcoming, loving, saw me, took me under his wing, took me to the Art Gallery of Ontario. If you haven't noticed, I love art. Looked at different images. So there weren't different images of God, diversity in our actual church building. He took us to the AGO. And that was our trip as a confirmation class. And it is at confirmation that I received my calling. Isn't that amazing? The experience of me being seen and seeing myself in other images that were holy opened up the space for me to hear God call me to ministry. That's powerful. So how do we do that? Exactly that. When I answered the call at St. James United Church in Etobicoke, one of my questions at the end of the interview was this. So you know I'm Black, right? Right? And some of the people, they don't realize that some of the people went like this. And I know what they meant by this. They meant that it's not important to them. You know, where is this? Where is she going with this? And my next thing was, I have 4 young children. Are they safe at your church? And they told me about this wonderful Sunday school program. Irene, you're familiar with St. James and the community there. And then the amazing thing they did, which made me fall in love with them and hope for a second interview, was this. They said, can we get back to you on that? They actually decided that they needed to think about it. And I thought, okay, these are my people. These are my people. Because we don't have the instant answers. We're not going to do the song and dance for you, Maya. You've just asked us an uncomfortable question. We're going to actually think about it. And we may get back to you. You know, may meaning, you know, if I get a second interview, which thank God after I was just like, why did I ask that question? Like, what's wrong with me? Get through the door first and then remind them that I'm Black. Hello, we're in a Zoom interview. They know, right? One of the things that I offer to you before we can have a little break, and I hope that we don't just push through, that we actually honor our bodies and the need to stand up and stuff like that. Whenever God sends a messenger to us, the messenger says what? Do not be afraid. I think how we move towards being anti-racist is to be bold, daring, and not be afraid. And to understand that when people react as if they're angry, that is usually a fair response. I'm not saying push on through. As ministers, we have to be pastoral. But if we could have allies in some of our committees with people in the congregation who can step aside with someone who is having an angry response, right? And we all know, ministers know about the meeting after the meeting. It used to be the parking lot meeting, but now it's like the post-Zoom meeting, getting on the phone meeting, email meeting, whatever, okay? Email string that, you know, magically we're not part of. Whatever you do, don't be afraid. And remember that when people are angry, and you know that this is a question of, you know, We have hymns that are originally sung in another language. And some of our churches feel comfortable only singing in English. And they don't see that as a racist response. Yet it is, because culture is, Irene, your Filipino culture, your Chinese culture, your heritage is attached to your race. It is. Language is part of it. So what if it's hard? We are singing. We sing phonetically. Just sing it. The fastest way of learning another language, or speaking actually, is to sing. You sing it, we sing the ABCs to our children. We don't go, okay, here's a chart of the alphabet, recite it. We sing it. So these multilingual hymns and Voices United, I'm not talking about more voices. I'm not talking about the next hymn book that's coming. And I hope there are multilingual hymns in there. I'm assuming so if we're going towards being anti-racist as a church, right? We have to sing the other language too. Actually, we don't need to sing the English, right? That would be an anti-racist move because it's sung in that language, and it's sung, I'm sure that phonetically it works best in the original language. If you are responding to that right now, I invite you to reflect on that and to pray on that, because if every conversation we have, we center it around God, we can't go wrong. Because God's message to us is what? Do not be afraid. So yes, that is how we rehumanize. I don't have bells and whistles. Every situation is different. But I think that having more of this, having book studies, having vulnerable and difficult conversations is how we move towards being an anti-racist church. We have resources, 40 days of anti-racism. I mean, that's something that I'm inviting my congregation to do over Lent, because Lent has 40 days in it. Engage with the books, engage with the difficult conversations, and really reflect and be ready. Because if we are successful, big if, because, we resist, and this, the civil rights movement is a long time ago, the internment camps, long time ago, and yet we still have Asian hate. We still have anti-Black racism. We still have anti-Brown racism. We have racism, right? So if we are successful, our churches are going to change. And the last thing that a church likes is change. We don't like it. It goes against tradition. So then, what do we fall back on? Do not be afraid. Do not be afraid. God is with us. I feel God is really pushing us in this direction. And if we really trust in God, and we get down from that mountaintop and we really go deep down into the valley in the darkness and be vulnerable, the light will shine and show us the way.
Thank you so much for the wisdom and the willingness to step into this. And I appreciate the openness and honesty, Maya, that it is a difficult conversation, and it must be exhausting in a way that I personally won't understand or can't. I want to thank everyone here for stepping in to be a part of this conversation as well. And as Reverend T was saying, the willingness to learn. So this is, for some of us, the beginning of a conversation, an exploration, an invitation to do the work. And it is most certainly work. And so we've been given an invitation to do the work of starting to be allies or deepening our allyship. So I'm just deeply grateful for our guests, for each of you stepping in to share of your experience, your heart, your wisdom, and your visions. Deeply enriching and unsettling in helpful ways. And I just pray that everyone who's here tonight can really reflect on this, take time and look inside, check in with yourself, as Maya says, and maybe through gratitude we can really start seeing people for who they are across difference, creating relationships, seeing their value. And perhaps I suspect we might also feel more seen and valued in this kind of an act. And I'm getting messages pouring in here too. Just thank you so much. People feeling like they have a bit more of an understanding. Thank you for the book list. And we're going to post that as well alongside this video on the website. So we want to close by thanking Carol Wilson again for her tireless work. Did Cynthia post also? Yes, you can see the link in the thread here. Thank you, Cynthia, for remembering to post that. If you click that link, you'll have the page open where this will be in the previous weeks. We want to thank our previous speakers, Dr. Brian Caruana in week 1, Reverend Michael Blair last week, Reverend Maya Douglas this evening, Reverend Sidney Elias, Reverend Irene T. Bless you, bless you, bless you. Thank you for being here.